welcome everybody. I'm Nick Kefalidis. This is our very first luncheon seminar for the winter and spring series. And today I'm very happy to have with us Professor Eve Troutt Powell. She's currently an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. And she will discuss with us a topic called Slaves in the Nursery, Childhood and Memories of Slavery in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Dr. Troutt received her bachelor's degree, her master's, and her PhD at Harvard prior to coming to Penn, and she taught for 10 years at the University of Georgia. She has received fellowships at the American Research Center in Egypt and the School of Science Research Council, and has been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In 2003, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. Quite an honor. Dr. Troutt Powell is the author of several books, including that entitled A Different Shade of Colonization, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of the Sudan, and others. So I will not take any more time, Dr. Troutt. We're happy to have you.
It's very nice to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. I hope that you will not take this personally in any way or as an insult that I do not have a prepared chapter to read to you. But I'm in the middle of writing this chapter, and I'm stuck. I'm really stuck. And so I'm going to give the broad outline of my chapter and where I am. And then I'm very open for suggestions, okay? So I am now writing a book about how people in the Nile Valley and in the Ottoman Empire, people of a particular generation, remembered slavery. Some of these people are former slaves, and some of them are slave owners. The two women that I'm talking about today were not, well, I'm not sure exactly if they themselves owned slaves, but they certainly grew up in households wealthy enough and big enough to have many, many slaves. This first woman right here is Hoda Sha'rawi. She was born in Egypt in 1879. She died in Egypt in 1947. And she was the founder, really, of the Egyptian women's movement. She was a forerunner of feminism in Egypt. And as I will tell you, in the 1919 and the 1920s, until the end of her life, she was the women's movement, she and many of her associates. And she wrote her memoirs. She started to write her memoirs about 1944. Her Arabic wasn't very good. She had sort of colloquial Arabic, but not very good grammar, and I'll explain why soon. So she dictated her memoirs and did not finish them. She didn't complete them when she died in 1947. To her left is her age mate and also really a colleague, although I don't know if they had a relationship with each other. This is Halide Adivar, who was a Turkish woman who grew up in the Ottoman Empire, so she sort of spanned the identities of being Ottoman and then becoming Turkish after World War I. She also was a leader of the Ottoman women's movement. She was a novelist, she was a writer, and she also was a leader of the nationalist movement in Turkey as Turkey began to, as a Turkish identity emerged through the construction of the Ottoman Empire. She was born in 1881 and she died in 1964. And she also wrote her memoirs before she died. She wrote her memoirs while living in New York City. She was teaching at Columbia University. She ran out of favor with Ataturk after the establishment of Turkey. And she went to New York and wrote her memoirs in English. And I'm not sure why she did that either. But this question of language and writing about these women's very controversial lives, not in their native languages, is sort of part of what I'm trying to get at. So let me just tell you a little bit about who they were historically before I get into their narratives. So World War I actually had huge ramifications for the Middle East. I won't go into all that. I'm sure a lot of you know about that. For those of us who work in Middle Eastern history, though, the World War I and the end of World War I, the problems with the borders that were created have still not been solved. Every single issue, every struggle that is being fought over in the Middle East today goes back to this time. And in Egypt, it was a particularly sad moment because Egypt, which had been occupied by the British since 1882, saw hope in the end of the World War I and hoped to send delegates to the League of Nations to plead for its right to independence from the British. Though occupying military administration in Egypt said no to those leaders who wanted to do so, one of whom was the husband of Hoda Sha'rawi, whose picture you've already seen. There was, not only did they withhold the passports of these men, who were known as the Waft, or delegation in Arabic, but they sent them in exile to Malta. And the whole country rose up in revolt against the British. Egypt had risen up in revolt before. What was particularly striking about the 1919 Egyptian Revolution, however, was that women stood at the forefront of many of the strikes. Those men who had been sent to Malta, their wives, became their delegates in Egypt and organized for them. And this was highly unusual in the Middle East at the time. This is not Hoda Sha'rawi, but it was thought that she was somewhere near. She was at many of these. And women like this represented the most elite women in Egyptian society, usually connected to the Ottoman Empire through marriage, often Turkish-speaking at home. And to have these elite, usually sequestered women who lived in households big enough to have gender segregation and to have harems, to have these women out in the streets protesting against the British, to have these women actually shot at by British soldiers was enough of an event to actually, if you ever go back, if you're ever interested in going back to the London Times or any other, the Herald Tribune in March of 1919, you can actually see pictures. It was a huge international controversy to see these veiled women rising up. That alone, to just see them rising up, was enough of a shift. But a huge media outcry arose after that. So this is Hoda Sha'rawi's moment. And after this moment, her husband comes back, and she continues to be a big part of the women's movement. In fact, is disappointed when the leaders of the Waqf come back to Egypt and eventually do become part rulers of Egypt. She's very disappointed that they do not grant women the rights that she had so long campaigned for. And in about 1926, there's a real shift between the women's movement and the Egyptian nationalist movement. And that continues until the end of her life. And she ends her life rather frustrated, but very, very famous, and is given the highest honors right before her death by the Egyptian government. Okay, so that's her. In 1923, let me just add one other thing. She's very famous for, she goes to Rome. She's an international traveler. She goes to a lot of women's conferences. And in 1923, returns from Rome to Cairo, and in a highly staged media event, steps off the train and takes off her veil. And there are 1 million statues around Egypt. And it's called Nahdat Misr, which means the awakening of Egypt, of a woman going like this with her veil, holding the Sphinx like this. And it's a nice little icon of Egyptian culture. And
all
that's
this time, the British are still in Egypt.
They're still there.
Until 48,
52.
52.
Until 52, right. They're still there. Right. Yeah. Right. And, yeah. So Egypt is kind of run by a triangular of a monarchy and a parliament, and the big triangle part is the British. Right, absolutely. All right, so that's Hoda, and I'll be coming back to her. She's the majority of the story. Okay. Now, this is Halide Adivar, who is very similar to Hoda in that she comes from an extremely privileged background. I think she takes off the veil earlier than Hoda does. She might not be quite as wealthy as Hoda. I mean, Hoda's really like the Jackie Kennedy, if you will, of Egyptian turn-of-the-century society. But this is Hoda Halide right here, still dressing rather conservatively. And she's right here, and she's next to Jamal Pasha, who was the leader of the Committee of Union and Progress. He was part of the triumvirate that dragged the Ottoman Empire into World War I. And it was Jamal Pasha, actually, who made the secret alliance with Germany, which was really to drag the Ottoman Empire down into the ashes and their eventual defeat. But he was part of a nationalist movement that she had been a part of, she had long been a part of. Well, they were all very young when this happened. And when I say very young, during World War I, they were in their mid-40s, which I like to think was extremely young. But anyway, so you can see how high up she was, and she was a big part of the movement. She did a lot of, during World War I, she did a lot of work for women in Syria as the Ottoman Empire tried to hold on to its closest Arab provinces. There was a huge famine in Syria during the war, and it was Holiday who went and did all kinds of charity work and brought food and stuff to Syrian women. And then when the war ended, Jamal Pasha and the other members of the triumvirate were executed, and Mustafa Kemal, or Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turks, became the president of the new republic by 1923, and she had to leave. She did go back, and she also received high honors from Turkey, and lived to the end of her life very honored and a revered leader in Turkey. Now, both of these women wrote their memoirs in Hoda in the 40s, Halide in the 20s, so she was still remembering. And they're part of a generation of people looking back at childhood and in immensely privileged childhoods in which there were slaves. Now, I read a lot of Egyptian historiography and look at a lot of stuff, and it's very interesting to me, and has been interesting for a long time, how silent on the subject of slavery so much work has been. And I'll just quote from an essay by Leila Ahmed, who is a historian I greatly admire, and whose work on Hoda Sharawi I find actually quite peerless. But she says that in this article that discussions of slavery, you don't find them because slavery had become rather rare. It was banned in 1890. Well, that is not the case, and I'm not mad at Leila Ahmed. She was working on something else, and I got all caught up in this, and once you become obsessive about it, you start finding things. But I really have found about 15 novelists, 10 poets, and then in Egypt, Hoda Sharawi, and then in the late Ottoman Empire, women writing about the harem, and all of it is about slavery, or a lot of it is about slavery. And I'm a cultural historian, and I know that sometimes other historians feel that this kind of evidence is very anecdotal, but I do think that when you're looking back at childhood memories of the existence of a certain kind of institution, this kind of evidence actually can tell us a great deal. And there's so much, there's just so many examples of people, Malik Hanum, Leila Hanum, writing about these years in their lives when there were slaves. What I find particularly interesting about Hoda Sharawi is the slaves disappear as she becomes an adult in her memoirs, but they don't disappear from her life. So what I'm hoping to investigate in this chapter, as I'm going to present it to you now, is what does it mean to write about in late middle age or older age, to write about your childhood coming out of a historical and political and cultural system in which slavery and a certain kind of economy were very much a part of life, into independent nationhood, independent statehood, into a kind of modern political awareness. So let me start with Hoda's presentation of her childhood, and then I'll look at, and the slaves, and then I'll look very quickly at Haliday's presentation, and then I will end with an image that you might find kind of troubling, and present this to you, and then ask for your help. Okay. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire in Egypt is very closely related, so I'm going to speak about it as if it was one thing, because Egypt really was, it was through Egypt that a lot of slaves came to the Ottoman Empire. And when I speak about that particular slave trade, I mean the African slave trade, and predominantly Sudanese slaves. So part of this system of slavery and the practices of enslavement included predominantly domestic slaves, mostly women, coming from Sudan and to some degree Ethiopia. But there was also another kind of slavery that came into the Ottoman Empire, from the Ottoman Empire into Egypt, that in the middle of the 19th century came from the Caucasus. And these were a group that are terribly overly grouped together called the Circassians, although there were different tribes and different ethnicities. For the sake of simplicity today, I will call them Circassian, who were escaping the Russian Empire's expansion into the Western Caucasus and also escaping Islamic uprising against the Russians, and began by the hundreds of thousands to flood as refugees into the Ottoman Empire, through Samsun, through Cyprus, and into Trebizond, and then finally into Istanbul. Thousands of girls were brought into domestic slavery, usually as concubines, through this system. So you have two different groups coming in. So you have people from the Caucasus coming in, predominantly European-looking, prized for their beauty, coming in as concubines, not as domestic slaves necessarily, but certainly not as wives with the same rights towards inheritance that a legal wife would have in one of these large households. And then you have slaves, black slaves coming into Africa. So both Hoda's household and Halideh's household were wealthy enough to be homes to this kind of spectrum, ethnic and racial spectrum of slaves. Hoda begins her quite beautiful memoirs, and if I speak of her sometimes critically, I do want to just take a moment to say her memoirs are precious in how she analyzes childhood. Her insights into what are the limitations of a system where questions cannot be asked are beautiful. I mean, I have come to really love this part of her as a writer. And when you find a moment like this, and let me read it to you, because I know the print's kind of small. Let me read this to you. She begins her memoirs by saying, "I used to imagine that I was not my mother's daughter, that my real mother was a slave girl who had died, and the truth was being withheld from me. Firmly convinced of this, I suffered all the more. I could keep everything suppressed until nightfall, but as soon as I laid my head on the pillow, I was overcome by anxieties, and frightening thoughts moved me to tears." So here she is writing about herself as a little girl, haunted by the idea, and this is her as a young woman, haunted by the idea that her mother had been a slave. She leaves this quote like this, and then describes her mother. What Hoda does not say, and that I have been piecing together through my research, is that, as it turns out, her mother probably was a slave. That her mother made the trek, and she describes this in her book, but she never asked her mother herself. So she gets this from her mother's brother, and she's afraid, as she says, to ask certain questions. Her mother made the trek from the Caucasus with her family, and they were a political family, and they got caught up in the violence, and she was sold to someone else who brought her to Egypt, where she became the concubine of Hoda's very wealthy, very powerful father, Muhammad Sultan Pasha. She was not his wife. He did have a wife who Hoda called al-Kabira, or Big Mama. She was the legal wife. It was Hoda's mother who was the slave. So here she presents this as if it were a dream. But if you read through even her own text and then look at the arrangements in the household, and also looking at other historians and the work that they've done, it's 90% possible that her mother actually was a slave. So this is what she says. Now let me describe what she says about other slaves in the household, not her mother. And these would be slaves who would be Sudanese slaves, okay? Hoda was a very smart child and was very pained that her brother was the favorite of everybody, although her relationship with her brother was very close. And she wanted to learn Arabic. She wanted to learn real Arabic, the real grammar, the classical grammar. And she wanted to study with a sheikh from Al-Azhar. And that was unusual for, I mean, she spoke Turkish and she spoke French. She had a French governess, but she wanted to speak Arabic. And so wealthy was her household that they were able to afford having a eunuch. And having a eunuch was a sign that you had millions of pounds, because eunuchs were very expensive to buy. And you could have a Circassian eunuch, or in the late 19th century, you would probably have a Sudanese eunuch. And they were, you know, and I don't need to explain eunuchs. I do to the undergraduates, and they get all skittish. But in charge of their household, in charge of the children, was a man named Said Aga, and he was a eunuch, and he raised her. And he figures very prominently throughout her memoirs as the one who's always telling her no. So when she asked to learn Arabic, and actually her mother says fine, and remember there's no real adult man in the house. They have a cousin who's sort of overseeing things. It is Said Aga, the slave, who says, "You can't. Why do you need to learn Arabic? And you're not going to be a doctor. You're not going to be a scientist. You don't need to know the grammar." He can't even read. And I mean, he's like, and she describes this, and she's furious with him. Although at other times she remembers him with great fondness. They were almost their carriage was almost run over in an accident in the street, and he sacrificed himself, threw himself over the horses, and heroically saved the children. And she said he did things like this constantly. Let me describe another instance. Peddlers would come, storytellers would come to the house to entertain this family. She was taken care of by nannies and nurses. And I'm going to just read a part that I have written, if you don't mind. Her sensitivity to slavery's presence was expressed not only in her dreams, as I've described to you, but also in the memories of the slaves' kindness to her. The slaves, she wrote, were industrious, completing their duties with sincerity, and I'm quoting her, and respectful of their employers. They loved the children of their employers, whom they brought up with their own hands, and we returned that love and that sincerity. The governesses, the maids, the wet nurses who took care of them had been with the family since before the children's birth and knew the history of all the household members. Interestingly, the children had heard a great deal about the childhoods of the slaves as well. Now I'm quoting her directly. Our nurses used to tell us stories about how they had been captured, what their own countries had been like, and the customs of their people, until we grew exhausted and they would tuck us in our beds. But the best nights, I'm saying like that because if only she'd written that down, my life would be so much easier. If only such a treasury right there of people's past, you know, gone into sleep. But the best nights of storytelling, nights that were almost like soirees, were when a former slave woman who held the honors with the title Sit al-Zahra, or Lady of the Flowers, came to their household to sell rose water and other perfumes. In her memoirs, Hoda described this woman in great detail, insisting several times on the dignity of her appearance. She was a dark-skinned woman who wore brightly colored clothing. Everyone in the household waited eagerly for her visits, and when she came, they begged her to stay. She would settle in, and in her loud voice, tell us her entertaining stories, and I'll just quote. And we would sit around her, our eyes fixed and our ears inclined. She would move from story to story, submitting to our wishes and urging. The room on nights like this would be filled with almost everybody in the household who came to hear. They would sit and the circle would widen, going outside of the room's door. Hoda then remembers going to bed, her head filled with dreams about Dada Zahra's tales. In fact, Hoda concludes, I am sure that it is mostly because of this blessed lady that we were able to widen our imaginations. I mean, she credits a slave with opening up her eyes to the world around her and opening up, you know, she knows that she heard about their past. All right, well, let's turn to the Ottoman Empire. Let's go to Istanbul. Okay, here's the slightly more glamorous Halliday of Edinburgh, who really was a lovely looking woman. And there are all kinds of portraits and pictures of her. And here are her memoirs. And she discusses slavery with a different kind of ambivalence than Hoda Sharawi. And I have lots and lots of quotes on slavery. I'll just read a couple of them to you because I don't want to go on too long. But this from the beginning of her memoirs. She's writing on page 7, and I'll just give you a little bit of it. She's describing a figure just like Said Aga, who was in Hoda's house. She also has a eunuch in her house. Ali is the manservant who takes care of her. He is her Lala, that indispensable personage in every old Turkish household for which no English, no European equivalent can exist, for it arose from roots wholly foreign to them, wholly oriental. The Lala was the natural outcome of the marked separation between the indoor and outdoor life of that day and that world. Indoors was the delicate, intimate rule of women. Out of doors was the realm of men. They could play there their proper role of protector, and one felt happy and secure in their presence. As a child, and as a child only, one could share to the full the freedom of the two worlds and one's Lala was one's natural companion into all the open-air places of experience. So this is her describing Ali, a man with whom she also stayed close throughout her life, and this is how she looks at him. Holiday's mother was a wife. Holiday's, so she did not have that same ambivalence. She didn't need to contest or distance herself from any ambivalent origins. She knew from who she came. And her father was an aide to the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, and so she had Sultan and other ministers. Well, the Sultan didn't come to her house, but ministers came into her house. Well, she knew who she was. And yet, still, in her many references to slaves in the book, and I'll just read you a couple. She is more sensitive to the racial differences among the slaves. One of the most interesting moments about relationships between slavery, and it's going to take me a little bit, a eunuch comes to the house and teases her. And I want to just describe this to you because it puts her into a fear, and I'll just describe this, okay? Will you bear with me for a minute if I read a slightly long passage? There in Father's room, in front of his writing table and sitting in his chair, was a eunuch. As these people were familiar sights in the palace, the circumstance was not in itself strange, but this eunuch was different from the stately black men I was accustomed to. His face was a light milk and coffee color, his features were more regular than my own, his eyes were big and of the troubling kind, sad and humorous and very beautiful. His large, handsome head was set on a crippled body with an enormous hunch on the back. I began walking around him in order to get a good view of the hunch, and then I stood and stared at him fascinated. I believed there was a curve of the smile of his mouth, but he kept them under control and returned my gaze seriously for a time. And then he sighed and rolled his eyes, his face taking on an extraordinary look of real suffering. Ah, I am waiting for my father. Who is thy father? That's her. My father, he looked astonished. My father is Adib Bey, of course. He's my father. Well, I'm talking of Adib Bey too, but he is my father. At least he was. I was his son, his firstborn till thou, a black foundling from the streets, came and bewitched both of us. I became crippled and black, and thou white, and took my place, and I was turned into the street. And she's horrified. I have never been torn between so many different sensations, belief in my wicked witchery, fear lest I might be found out and sent into the streets and become a negress once more, pity for his miserable fate, and hatred toward him for making me feel all of this. I have seen many great actors on the stage since, but it seems to me even now, never one with such sincere and artistic power of rendering emotion. And then the father comes in and calls the guy a black witch, and they all start laughing. And this is her description of. There are hundreds more. The book is filled with references. They would tease each other and call each other slave because her hair was kind of thick. People would call her a slave. They would call. I mean, it's just all over the place. But this is how they remember it in the 1920s. Now, I told you, I'm turning back to Egypt now. This is Hoda. This is from a wonderful illustrated journal that was very popular in Cairo in the 1920s and Cairo and Alexandria in the 1920s and 1930s, called El Kashkul, which means the notebook. And these are, I mean, I have about 15 of these volumes. They're just beautiful, and there's real watercolors. I mean, the artwork that's done, but they're really interesting for how Sudan is depicted and how Africa, and different, John Bull of England and stuff. But this is Hoda Shadawi, who was, this is from an article written in 1926. And these journals would start off with a big picture like this, and then there'd be a little caption, and then the article would follow. And it would usually be some kind of satiric political discussion. There were hundreds of journals like this in Cairo at this time, coming out of Cairo at this time. So here's Hoda. By the way, her look has changed a little bit. And I mean, she's really a dominant matron here, you know, respectably rendered, all right? She's not caricatured as she had been, she often could be in other depictions. This is Said Aga, all right? And as I continued reading her memoirs, when she leaves off with the slaves, when you get to the end of her political fighting with the Egyptian nationalists, he's always at her side. She has a huge fight with the leader of the parliament, Saad Zaghloul. He's always at her side. And I realized that he never leaves her. He's with her until he dies, and well into her adulthood. And so here he is, and the caption, which I don't have here, but the caption is about where is independence, Aina el-Istiqlal. And he says, it starts off with him saying, but Hoda Hanum, which is an honorific, what are these men going to do if there's no independence? And he's speaking about political independence, and she says, you're a better man than they are, Saeed Aga. You know how to handle yourself. Don't worry about independence. So here is a woman, him right there, making jokes about his independence. And what does that say then about where the figure of the slave stands as these women, these prominent people in nations that are becoming stronger and stronger? How do they reconcile with this incredibly intimate part of not only their history, but their country's history? Yeah.
Still wondering what in a way, what the quandary is. I'm suggesting, let me try to be clear again, if the problem is knowing how to deal with her as a possibly coming out of a slavery, I'm trying to suggest, and I thought you were too, frankly, that there is slavery and there's slavery. There are different kinds of slavery, viewed differently in the Ottoman Empire of the time in Egypt. That's all. For me.
My quandary, well, I agree with you, that's not unclear. What I'm wrestling with is how to reconcile these sensibilities on her part and on Haliday's part of looking back at certain kinds of institutions of marriage, at certain kinds of institutions in which children are told the truth. She wasn't told that her father really died for like 6 years. Not being told that she was really getting married and why she was getting all the presents, things like that. I mean, it would be Saeed Aga who would finally tell her the truth and stuff like that. And she really poignantly complains, why keep women in perpetual childhood? She's writing her memoirs at a time when others are also writing about marriage and slavery as a perpetual childhood that prevents Egypt from being the Egypt it can really be. That such institutions prevent Egyptians from becoming full members of society. Women and even former slaves don't become full members of society. So here she is on her trajectory of trying to become a full member of society, so eloquently articulating for others the right to do that, and yet she can't get past it for this part of her household. That's my quandary. Perhaps I should just say, well, she's of a certain generation, that's how it was, but I would like to complicate it further.
Maybe I'm not understanding something, but
okay.
If I'm understanding right, here she is upset with railing against denial of information, being kept in the dark about things. She's writing this memoir in the 40s. She's got to now be relatively well along in her life,
right,
if not older.
Right.
She kind of knows that her mother was a slave,
Right.
but she refuses. You've had to unearth
Right.
this. She will not say so. So this diatribe against being kept from the truth.
Right.
And she won't out with her own family truth, even though it's the end of her life and it's kind of free to be there with the truth. And where being out there with the truth might be liberating for her readers, for future generations.
Right.
And it goes to issues of class, and it goes to issues of race. So it could be really illuminating. And she knows, but she won't say.
Right.
What is that about?
That's it, Mike. You hit it.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
That's it.
I mean, it doesn't
That's
seem to me it's a
exactly.
dilemma
It's just
about
her,
her
but
childhood. It's a
yeah,
dilemma about
yeah.
truth. It's a dilemma about
Yeah.
her as an adult.
Yeah.
It's her refusal as a responsible adult with not much at stake anymore to level when her whole memoir is about the imperative to level.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you very much.